Good evening, night creatures. This evening we talk about the fourth primordial deity of procreation and cosmic desire, Eros. Settle in and listen to the force that moves towards. There is a question that every tradition has asked, and that none has fully answered. Why does anything move toward anything else? Not the mechanics of motion, not the physics of attraction or the chemistry of bondu, or the biology of the drive toward reproduction. These describe how things move toward each other. The question is different. The question is why there is movement toward it all. Why the universe is arranged such that separate things reach for each other. Why isolation is not the default condition. Why the gap between things is not simply maintained as a gap, but is instead crossed, bridged, closed. The ancient Greek tradition gave this tendency a name before it gave it a story. The name was Eros. The tendency was the most fundamental feature of the world, more fundamental than any specific god or any specific event. More fundamental even than the specific forms of love and desire that the name would come to mean in the later tradition. Eros was the original movement toward, the first reaching, the force that made the universe generative rather than inert, relational rather than isolated, creative rather than static. He was fourth in Hesiod's enumeration of the Primordials: Chaos, then Gaia, then Tartarus, then Eros. But in some readings he was first in a different sense. First, not in the sequence of emergence, but in the sequence of necessity. Chaos could exist without Gaia. Gaia could exist without Tartarus. But neither of them could produce anything further without Eros. Without the force that moved things toward each other, without the principle of attraction that made combination possible, the primordials would have remained what they were: separate, isolated, not generative. Eros was what made the world productive. He was not Aphrodite's Eros, not the small-winged boy with the golden and leaden arrows, the charming minor deity of romantic love who caused mortals and gods alike to fall into the complications of desire. That Eros was real and had his own domain, but the Eros of the cosmogony was older and larger and more fundamental, was the force that preceded the gods, and that was in some sense the condition of their existence. The principle that made the production of new things from existing things possible. He was the love that was before love had a face. He was the movement toward that was before the moving things had names. He was the force. And forces are the hardest things to write about, because forces are not characters in the ordinary sense. They do not have faces or histories or the narrative arcs that characters require. They have effects. They have the traces of their operation in the things that move because of them, the things that reach because of them, the things that combine and create and produce because of them. This is the story of Eros told through his effects. Through the reaching and the combining and the creating that would not have been possible without him. Through the love stories and the creative acts and the philosophical attempts to understand what was happening when things moved toward each other. Through the world that exists, because the world was arranged for things to move toward each other rather than away. This is his story, which is also, in a sense, every story. Because every story is about something moving toward something else. The Primordial Force. Part 1. What was there before the stories? Chapter 1. The Fourth and the First. He was the fourth of the Primordials in the sequence Hesiod gave, and the question of why he was fourth, why the sequence went Chaos, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, rather than some other arrangement, has occupied readers of the Theogony since the text was first transmitted. One reading, the sequence was cosmological, describing the order of emergence of the world's fundamental features. First, the undifferentiated void, then the surface, the ground, the first great specific thing, then the depth, the bottom, the below, then the force of attraction, the principle of movement toward. This reading gave Eros a specific cosmological role. He was the force that was required after the basic structural features of the cosmos were in place. Chaos had given the world its original condition. Gaia had given it the surface. Tartarus had given it the depth. And now, the world had its structure, had the above and the below, the surface and the abyss, the basic spatial framework within which things could exist. But having the structure was not the same as having the world. The structure, without the force of attraction, would have been a static structure. Three separate primordial realities existing in their respective positions, without producing anything further, without generating the world of the divine beings and the mortal world, and all the extraordinary variety of what the mythology described. Eros was what made the structure generative. He was the fourth because the structure needed to be in place before the force of generation could operate, needed the surface and the depth and the basic spatial framework before the movement toward could mean anything. And then the force arrived, and the static structure became the generative cosmos, and the world began to produce. This reading made him the hinge, the turning point between the static and the generative, the force that transformed the framework of the cosmos into the productive world. Another reading, he was not fourth in emergence but fourth in enumeration, and the fourth position was the position of emphasis, of the one whose presence completed the set, the one whose placement last in the list gave it its weight. In the Greek rhetorical tradition, the last named was often the most important. The climax came last. On this reading, Eros was the culmination of the primordials, the force without which the others were incomplete, the principle whose presence was the condition of the others' significance. Chaos without Eros was mere void. Gaia without Eros was mere ground. Tartarus without Eros was mere depth. But all three with Eros were the foundations of a generative world. A world that was going somewhere, that was producing, that was moving toward. Both readings were true, in the way that cosmological claims are true, not as precise historical accounts of a sequence of events, but as accurate descriptions of the structure of the reality being described. He was the hinge and the culmination, the force that made the cosmos generative, and the principle without which the other primordials were incomplete. Chapter 2. The nature of the primordial force. What was Eros at the primordial level before the mythological narrative gave him a form, before the tradition associated him with the winged boy and the arrows, before the philosophical tradition tried to understand him as a concept? He was the tendency of the separate to move toward combination. This is the most precise description available, and it is worth sitting with before moving to the more familiar forms. Separate things had a tendency. They were not indifferent to each other. They were not simply coexisting in the void, each one sealed in its own being, each one simply what it was without any pull toward what it was not. They had, the primordials had, the first things had, a tendency toward the other, toward the combination, toward the production of something that neither was alone. This tendency was Eros. Not Eros understood as desire in the psychological sense. Not the feeling, the longing, the conscious experience of wanting. The pre-psychological, pre-conscious version of the same principle. The tendency, the pull, the movement. Toward that was prior to any conscious experience of it. The tendency was real at every level of the cosmos. The particles tended toward combination. The atoms tended toward bonding. The molecules tended toward the more complex molecules. The simple organisms tended toward the more complex organisms. The individual beings tended toward the community. The mortal tended toward the other mortal, in the fundamental human movement that was the foundation of every family, every friendship, every civilization. He was in all of these tendencies, not as a conscious agent intervening to produce the combination, not the divine matchmaker arranging the coming together. As the force that was the tendency itself, the principle that was the movement toward, the reality that made combination possible by being the inclination toward it. He was the world's own tendency toward itself, the cosmos reaching for its own complexity, the universe's fundamental orientation toward the more, the further, the combined, the new. Chapter 3. Self-sufficiency and its limits. He was the argument against self-sufficiency. Every cosmology had to address the question of why the original unity, the undifferentiated, the void, the chaos that was before specific things, had not simply remained what it was. Why had the original condition produced anything further? Why was there a world rather than nothing, or rather than only the original condition persisting in its original form? The answer was Eros. The original condition, chaos, had within it the tendency toward the further. The undifferentiated had within it the movement toward that produced the first differentiations. The void was not a stable void, was not the self-sufficient nothingness that would have remained forever if it had been truly self-sufficient. It had the force of the movement toward, and the movement toward produced the first specific things, and the first specific things had the movement toward, and the movement toward produced the more specific things, and so on through the whole of the cosmological narrative. He was the argument that self-sufficiency was not the cosmos's fundamental orientation. The cosmos was not arranged to produce isolated things that persisted in their isolation. The cosmos was arranged to produce things that moved toward other things, that combined with other things, that produced from the combination new things that neither had been alone. This was not only a cosmological claim, it was also a claim about value. If Eros was among the first things, if the movement toward was among the fundamental features of the cosmos, then the movement toward was not a contingent feature of some things, but a fundamental feature of everything. The tendency toward the other was not an accident of biology or psychology that some beings happen to have. It was the cosmic principle. It was what the cosmos was arranged around. Self-sufficiency was not the ideal. Connection was not the fallen condition of beings who ought to be complete in themselves. The reaching toward was not the sign of lack, but the sign of the cosmos's own most fundamental tendency. He was the cosmos's own argument against isolation. Chapter 4. The Force in the Matter. The pre-Socratic philosophers, the thinkers who came before Socrates and who were developing the first systematic accounts of the natural world, found themselves needing something like Eros, even when they did not use his name. Empedocles named it directly. He called it philia, love, friendship, attraction, and posited it alongside nekos, strife, repulsion, division, as one of the two fundamental forces that govern the cosmos. The four elements, earth, water, fire, air, moved in response to these two forces. Love brought them together in combination. Strife drove them apart. This was the cosmological Eros, translated into the vocabulary of the early naturalists. The force of attraction that produced the world's complexity from its simple elements. The principle of combination that was the condition of everything that existed as a combination, which was everything except the simplest elements themselves. Without love, Empedocles argued, the elements would be in a state of maximum separation, each one isolated, unmixed, the universe a collection of four separate spheres of the elements, without any of the combinations that constituted the world of experience. With love, the elements combined, and the combinations produced the minerals, the plants, the animals, the cosmos of complex things that the world actually was. This was Eros at work. The movement toward that made combination possible, the force that was the condition of complexity, the principle without which the cosmos would have been four spheres of unmixed elements persisting in their isolation. The Stoics would develop this further. Their concept of the logos, the rational principle that pervaded the cosmos, that was the reason in things that organized the material world into the ordered world, was not simply reason in the abstract sense. The logos was also the pneuma, the breath, the divine fire that ran through the cosmos as its animating principle. And the animating principle had the quality of Eros. It drew things toward their proper places, organized them into the patterns that expressed the cosmic reason, moved them toward the combination and the completion that their individual natures were reaching for. He was in the logos, in the cosmic reason, in the organizing principle, in the force that moved things not only toward each other, but toward the specific combinations that expressed their natures most fully. Part 2. The First Expressions. Chapter 5. What he made possible. He made the first generation possible. Without him, the primordials were a set of separate cosmological features, the void, the ground, the depth, coexisting without producing anything further. With him, the tendency toward the other was in the world, and the other was reached for, and the reaching produced the first divine generation. Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the sky, in the intimacy that was the first great union of separate primordials, the covering and the covered, the above and the below, the complementary opposites whose union was the world's first great production. Their union produced the Titans, the first great divine generation, the vast beings who would govern the world in the first age of the organized cosmos. This union was Eros. Not Eros as the agent who arranged the union, not the matchmaker who brought the earth and the sky together. Eros as the principle that made the union possible, the tendency toward the other that was in both of them. The movement toward that was the condition of the reaching that produced the intimacy that produced the Titans. He was in the rain. The rain was the sky reaching toward the earth, was the sky's movement toward the below, the above descending to the surface, the distance between the sky and the earth being crossed by the water that fell from above to below. The rain was the cosmological expression of the tendency toward the other, the above reaching toward the below, the sky reaching toward the earth, the movement toward expressing itself in the most fundamental ecological fact of the relationship between the sky and the surface. He was in the growth, the seed in the earth reaching toward the light above, the below reaching toward the above, the darkness reaching toward the brightness, the earth expressing the tendency toward the other in the growth of every plant that pushed upward toward the sky. The growth was Eros in the biological mode. The movement toward that was the condition of the living world's complexity. He was the condition of the world's productivity. Not the producer himself, not the one who made the specific things. The force that made production possible by making the movement toward possible. The principle without which the making of new things from existing things could not happen. Chapter 6. The Orphic Eros. In the Orphic tradition, the tradition of the mystery religion associated with Orpheus, the tradition that developed its own distinct cosmological account, alongside and in dialogue with the Hesiodic tradition, Eros appeared in an even more fundamental form. In the Orphic cosmogony, Eros, sometimes called Phanes, the shining one, the revealer, was the being who hatched from the cosmic egg. The egg was the world in its potential form, the organized potential of the cosmos, the specific form that the undifferentiated had taken as it moved toward differentiation. And from the egg came Eros/Phanes, the first being, the original divine, the light bringer who illuminated the void and made the world visible. This Eros was the first light as well as the first love. The illumination and the attraction were the same thing. The force that revealed and the force that drew toward were not two separate forces, but two expressions of the same primordial principle. To illuminate was to make visible. To make visible was to make approachable. To make approachable was to enable the movement toward, and the movement toward was Eros. He was golden-winged in the Orphic account, not the small wings of the later Eros, the child's wings, the cute accessory of the romantic deity, the enormous wings of the primordial, the wings that spanned the cosmos, the wings whose beating set the air in motion and whose motion was itself the first movement of the world, the movement from stasis to dynamism, from the static primordial to the productive cosmos. The Orphic Eros was both older and more specific than the Hesiodic Eros, more specific in the sense of having a form, the egg, the hatching, the golden wings, the light, but older in the sense that the Orphic tradition made him even more fundamental than the Hesiodic tradition did, made him the first being rather than the fourth, the condition of everything rather than the fourth of the foundational conditions. The two traditions were not in contradiction. They were approaching the same reality from different angles. The Hesiodic tradition emphasizing Eros as the force within the cosmos, the condition of the cosmos's generativity. The Orphic tradition emphasizing Eros as the producer of the cosmos, the being who hatched from the potential and illuminated the void. Both were pointing at the same thing, the force of attraction and generation that was the condition of everything. Chapter 7. The Cosmological Love. The love that was cosmological was not the love that mortals usually meant by the word. It was not the feeling, the longing, the experience of desire and affection. It was the structural feature of the cosmos, the tendency toward combination, the movement toward, the force that made the generative universe possible. But it was not entirely separate from the love that mortals meant. The same force that moved the elements toward combination moved the mortal toward the other mortal. The same principle that was in the rain reaching toward the earth was in the person reaching toward the beloved. The cosmological and the personal were not two different things, but the same thing at different scales. This was the claim that the Greek philosophical tradition, and especially the Platonic tradition, would develop most fully. The love that was in the cosmos was the love that was in the person. The tendency toward combination and generation that was the cosmos's own fundamental orientation was the tendency that expressed itself in the human being's movement toward the other, the beautiful, the good. He was in all of it, not differently, not as the cosmological force in one context and as something else in the personal context. As the same force, expressing itself at different scales, in different forms, with different specific characters, depending on the specific natures of the things that were in the movement toward. The movement toward was the same. The cosmos and the person were both expressions of it. The scale and the form varied. The force was one. Chapter 8. The Gift of the Incomplete. He was the gift to the incomplete. This sounds like a diminishment. The force of desire given to beings who lack what they desire. The force of reaching given to beings who have not arrived. And in one reading, it was a diminishment. Desire was the mark of lack, the sign of incompleteness, the evidence that the desiring being was not whole. But this reading was the partial reading. The fuller reading saw the incompleteness differently. The complete thing, the thing that had everything, that lacked nothing, that had no gap between what it was and what it needed, had no Eros. The complete thing was static. It was what it was, and it was finished being what it was, and it produced nothing further. The complete thing was, in the mythological imagination, the dead thing, the inert thing, the thing that was sealed in its own completeness and could not reach toward what it was not. The incomplete thing, the thing that was not yet all it could be, that had the gap between what it was and what it was reaching toward, that had the movement toward, that was the expression of the gap, had Eros, had the force that moved it toward the combination that would make it more than what it was alone, had the tendency that made it generative rather than static. He was the force that turned incompleteness into productivity, The gap that was a wound in the purely static view was the opening that was the condition of the reaching in the dynamic view. The lack was the locus of the movement toward. The incompleteness was the condition of the generation. He was the gift to the incomplete, the force that made the incompleteness the source of the new, rather than only the sign of the insufficient. The stories of desire. Part 3. The myths of movement toward. Chapter 9. Eros and Psyche. The story of Eros and Psyche was the story of love learning what love was. This was its deepest content, not a story about the complications of romantic desire or the difficulties of the divine-mortal relationship, though it was about those things too. The story of the love that moved toward the soul was the story of the love that moved toward its own nature. Psyche meant soul. She was the mortal woman of extraordinary beauty, beauty that was so extreme that it was compared to Aphrodite's, which was not a comparison to make lightly. She was the mortal who expressed the quality of the beautiful soul, the beauty that was not only the surface, but the interior, the beauty that was the external form of the interior quality. He fell in love with her, the god of love, in the form that was Aphrodite's son, the late form, the form with the wings and the arrows, fell in love with the mortal. He fell in love with the soul. This was the mythology's most compressed statement of the direction of Eros, not the movement of the inferior toward the superior, not the mortal looking up to the divine looking toward the mortal. The love that was the cosmic force encountering the specific mortal soul and moving toward it. He kept himself hidden from her. This was the condition of their love in the early period. She knew him in the dark, in the night, in the form of his presence, without the form of his visibility. She knew his voice and his touch, and the quality of his presence without knowing his face, without knowing what he was. She looked at him. The mythology was specific about this. She looked against the condition, against the instruction that the condition required. She held the lamp above him as he slept, and she looked at the one who had been invisible to her, whose face she had been living without. She saw him. He was beautiful. The mythology emphasized this, not the abstract divine beautiful, not the formal perfection of the divine. Beautiful in a way that was immediately and personally beautiful. The specific beauty of the face that was exactly the right face. That was the face of the love that had been present in the dark. She dropped wax from the lamp onto him, the small catastrophe. He woke and found her looking and left, because the condition had been violated, and the condition had been the condition of the love's possibility. She pursued him. This is the mythology's most important move in the story. She did not accept the loss passively. She did not grieve and wait for the love to return. She went after it. She undertook the impossible tasks that Aphrodite set. She descended into the underworld. She carried the box of Persephone's beauty back to the upper world. She looked into the box. She fell into the death-like sleep. She was found. He came back to her. The story ended, in the version that was a comedy rather than a tragedy, with the reunion and the immortality and the divine marriage. The story was about the movement toward that persisted through the difficulty of the crossing. The love that did not simply dissolve when the conditions changed, but that continued to move toward, even when the movement toward required the impossible journey. He was in the story as the love that moved toward the soul. She was in the story as the soul that moved toward the love. The story was about the meeting, the mutual movement toward, the complementary reaching, the combination that neither could achieve alone. Chapter 10. What Eros Did with the Arrow. The arrows were the mythology's most vivid expression of the specific quality of desire, its suddenness. The way desire arrived without preparation, without the permission of the desiring person, without the coordination of the rational intelligence that might have chosen differently if it had been consulted. The golden arrow that kindled desire, the lead arrow that extinguished it. The mythology gave him these instruments to make the point about the nature of the force he governed. It was not a force that asked. It arrived. It changed what it touched without the consent of the changed. This quality, the unconsented nature of desire, the way it arrived in the person rather than being chosen by the person, was the quality of the force at its most fundamental. The cosmological Eros did not ask the atoms whether they wanted to combine. The atoms combined because the force was in them, because the tendency was their nature, because the movement toward was what they were before any question of consent was applicable. The arrows expressed this at the personal level. The golden arrow struck the person, and the desire was there, fully formed, immediately operative, not the result of a process of deliberation, but the sudden fact of the desire. The person was in the movement toward before they had decided to be. This was both the gift and the problem. The gift, the movement toward, was not dependent on the courage of the decision, not contingent on the rational calculation of the advantages of the connection. It arrived. It was there before the fear of it could prevent the reaching. The arrows made possible the love that the deliberating person might have talked themselves out of. The problem, the movement toward, was not chosen. The person was moved before they had chosen to be moved. The desire was theirs, was genuinely theirs, was the expression of their nature. But it had not been decided by the choosing part of them. He was the force that made the distinction between the desired and the chosen necessary. The force that moved without asking. The gift that arrived without announcement. The mythology acknowledged both qualities. The arrows could cause suffering, could cause the mismatched love, the unrequited love, the love that was genuinely felt, and that was for the wrong person in the wrong circumstance. The arrows could cause the comedy and the tragedy alike. But the arrows were also the condition of the reaching that would not have happened without them, the love that the person would have been too afraid to feel without the force arriving before the fear could prevent it. Chapter 11. The Loves of the Gods. The mythological tradition preserved the loves of the gods as the most vivid expressions of what the force of movement toward looked like in its most concentrated form. Zeus and Ganymede. The king of the gods, the most powerful being in the universe, moved toward the most beautiful of mortals, moved toward the beauty with the force that was the same force at work in the cosmological and the personal and the divine. The movement toward was not scaled by the scale of the mover. the god of gods and the most modest mortal, were both subject to the same force. Apollo and Hyacinth, the god of light and beauty and all the most gleaming qualities of the divine, moved toward the mortal youth with the quality of the movement, toward that exceeded what Apollo's enormous power could protect against. Hyacinth died. The west wind's jealousy intervened. The discus was blown off course. The beloved was killed by the very object of the love's competition. The flower that bore his name was the memorial. The specific small mortal beauty remembered in the flower that was also the mark of grief. Aphrodite and Adonis. The goddess of love herself, the being who was the principle of the movement, toward in its personal divine form, moved toward the mortal youth with the force that even the divine was not exempt from. She who governed the force was subject to the force. She felt what everyone she moved felt. The love she gave was also the love she received. The force she was the principle of was also the force she could not escape. These stories were not only the stories of specific loves. They were the mythology's account of the universality of the force, the demonstration that the movement toward was not the property of any specific kind of being, not the condition of the weak or the mortal or the incomplete. It was the condition of everything. The most powerful god and the simplest mortal were both in the force. The god who was the principle of love was subject to love. The king of the gods could not exempt himself from the reaching. He was in all of these loves as the force, as the movement toward that was in the divine as much as the mortal. Chapter 12. The loves of the mortals. The mortal loves were the mythology's most abundant material. The stories of the heroes and their loves, the stories of the ordinary mortals and their extraordinary desires, the stories of the reaching toward that went right, and the reaching toward that went catastrophically wrong. Orpheus and Eurydice, the love that moved toward even death, that moved toward the underworld, that moved toward the impossible return, that persisted past the ordinary limit of what desire could achieve. The love that was so completely the movement toward that it descended into the kingdom of the dead to retrieve what the movement toward was directed at. Orpheus's music was the movement toward made audible. The music that moved the stones and the trees and the rivers, that moved even Hades and Persephone, was the expression of the force at its most concentrated and most beautiful. When the music was the expression of the love was the music, and the music moved everything, because the force that moved everything was in the music. The failure, the turning, the backward look, the violation of the condition that had been the condition of the possible return, was the failure of the movement toward to sustain itself through the completion. The love that was everything could not trust the gift of the return. The love that had moved toward even death could not trust the last steps of the return from death. This was the mythology's most honest account of the limit of the force. The limit was in the quality of the love itself. The force could move toward. It could not guarantee the arrival. The arriving required something beyond the force, required the capacity to sustain the movement toward all the way through, to trust the gift, to keep moving without looking back. Pyramus and Thisbe, the love that was separated by the wall, the barrier that was between the lovers, the division that kept the movement toward from its object. The movement toward found the crack in the wall, the opening, the small passage through the barrier, and whispered through it. The tragedy of Pyramus and Thisbe was the tragedy of the movement toward going wrong, not because the love was insufficient, but because the circumstances were terrible, because the wrong information arrived at the wrong moment, because the interpretation of the evidence was wrong, because the action taken on the wrong interpretation could not be undone. The movement toward was not protected by its intensity from the circumstances that could defeat it. The force could be fierce and real, and still be subject to the circumstances that the force could not control. Part 4. The Philosophy of Desire. Chapter 13. Plato's Symposium. The Symposium was the most sustained philosophical examination of Eros in the Western tradition, and it examined him from multiple angles, through multiple voices, in the way that the most important questions are examined when the examination is serious. Not through a single definitive account, but through the accumulation of different accounts, each one capturing something true, and each one missing something that the others supplied. Phaedrus spoke first. He argued that Eros was the oldest of the gods and the greatest benefactor of human beings. The lover would not do shameful things before the beloved, would be motivated to the noblest actions by the love, would rather die than dishonor themselves in the presence of the one they loved. An army of lovers would be invincible. The movement toward the beloved was the movement toward excellence, toward the best version of the self. This was the account of Eros as the force that elevated, the love that made the person reach not only toward the beloved, but toward the version of themselves worthy of the beloved. The movement toward as the movement upward, the reaching that was also the aspiring. Aristophanes told the myth of the divided beings. Originally, humans were round and complete, with 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces. They were powerful and self-sufficient. The gods feared them, and Zeus cut them in half. Each half has been searching for its other half ever since. The reaching toward is the reaching for the completion that was lost in the division. This was the account of Eros as the movement toward wholeness. The desire was the desire for the completion that was the original condition, the unity that the division had ended. The love was the recognition of the other half, the specific recognition of this person as the one whose presence made the divided being feel complete. The myth was beautiful and vulnerable to the obvious objection. If we are looking for our other half, why do most loves not last? Why do people love multiple people? Why does the search produce so much error? Aristophanes' account was the romantic account, the one that felt true to the experience of the sudden recognition and was less true to the experience of the long work of maintaining the love. Socrates reported the account of Diotima. She described Eros not as a god but as a great spirit, a being between the divine and the mortal, a messenger who carried prayers and sacrifices upward and divine commands downward. He was the child of Poros and Penia, of resource and poverty. He had the qualities of both parents, the reaching and the resourcefulness of resource, the lack and the incompleteness of poverty. He was neither full nor empty, neither wise nor ignorant, neither beautiful nor ugly. He was the between. And the account of the ascent, from the love of one beautiful body, to the love of all beautiful bodies, to the love of beautiful souls, to the love of beautiful activities and laws, to the love of beautiful knowledge, to the beautiful itself. The ascent from the specific to the universal, from the beautiful thing to the beautiful, from the movement toward the particular to the movement toward the absolute. This was the account of Eros as the force of philosophical ascent, the desire as the beginning of the philosophical journey, the recognition of beauty in the specific thing that was the beginning of the movement toward the understanding of beauty itself. Chapter 14. What Diotima Knew. Diotima's account was the most philosophically rich and the most contested. She understood Eros as the philosopher's force, as the force that was at work in the philosophical enterprise, in the pursuit of wisdom and truth and the beautiful. The same force that moved the lover toward the beloved moved the philosopher toward the truth. The same tendency toward the other that was in the cosmological order was in the philosophical practice. This was a genuine insight. The philosophical practice had the quality of desire. The philosopher who was genuinely in pursuit of wisdom was not someone who had wisdom and was expressing it. The philosopher was someone who was reaching toward wisdom, who had the gap between the current understanding and the full understanding, and who was moved by the gap to cross it. The movement toward in philosophy was Eros. The desire for the truth was the same force as the desire for the beloved. The reaching of the philosophical intelligence was the same principle as the reaching of the loving heart. But Diotima's account was also vulnerable to the charge of diminishment. The account of the ascent from the specific beautiful person to the beautiful itself treated the specific as a stepping stone rather than as the destination. The beautiful person was the beginning of the journey, the first rung of the ladder, the initial object of the movement toward. The destination was the universal, the abstract, the beautiful itself. This diminished the specific. The mortal beloved was treated not as the end of the desire, but as the means to the more important end. The specific person was the occasion for the philosophical ascent, rather than the irreplaceable other that the love was directed at. He resisted this reading, or rather, the primordial Eros, the cosmological Eros, the force that was the world's own tendency toward the specific, resisted it. The cosmological Eros did not move toward the universal by means of the specific. It moved toward the specific. It moved toward the combination. The water combined with the specific molecule, not with the universal concept of combination. The lover moved toward the specific beloved, not toward the universal beautiful. Diotima saw something real. The desire could be the force that moved the person toward the philosophical. But the seeing of this required careful holding, alongside the insistence that the specific was also real, that the specific beloved was not only a rung on the ladder, but the object of the love in its own right, that the movement toward the specific was as genuinely Eros as the movement toward the universal. He was in both, in the specific and in the philosophical. The force did not have to choose. Chapter 15. The Arrow and the Wound. The mythology gave him arrows. The philosophy gave him wings, gave him the quality of the between, the capacity to move between the mortal and the divine, the messenger quality that was the condition of the force's operation across the gap between the separate things. Both images were accurate. Both captured something essential. The arrow, the force arrived. It struck. It produced the desire before the person had consented to desire. It was the unconsented movement toward, the desire that was there before the choosing had happened. The arrow was the mythology's image for the way desire was not chosen, but arrived, was a feature of the world that happened to the person rather than a decision the person made. The wings, the force moved. It was the between, was in the gap between the separate things, was the movement across the gap, was the quality of the transit rather than only the quality of the arrival. The wings were the mythology's image for the way desire was a motion rather than only a state, a crossing rather than only a longing. Together, the force arrived, the arrow, and it moved between the wings. The desire that was there before it was chosen was also the force that moved through the gap between the desiring and the desired. The wound of the desire and the flight of the reaching were the same force in different moments. He was the arrow and the wings, the force that wounded and the force that flew. The desire that arrived and the movement toward that was the desire's expression. The wound was not only the suffering. The wound was the opening, the place where the self was penetrated by the other, where the self became permeable to what was outside it, where the boundary of the self was crossed by the force that the self could not resist. The wound was the condition of the crossing. The wound was where the other entered. This was the most intimate thing about Eros, not the reaching, but the receiving of the arrow. The moment of vulnerability, the moment when the force arrived and the self was no longer sealed. The force in the world. Part 5. Eros in everything. Chapter 16. The love in the growing things. He was in the growth. This was the claim that the ancient world made with considerable confidence, and it was a claim that the biological world confirmed in the specificity of its mechanisms. The growing things moved toward. The root moved toward the water. The shoot moved toward the light. The flower opened toward the sun. The seed sought the soil. These were not metaphors. These were the actual behaviors of the actual plants. The tropic responses, the growth patterns, the movement toward that was as real in the biological as in the mythological. The plant moved toward. It reached. It was in the movement toward as surely as any conscious being was in the movement toward. He was in the plant's movement toward the light, not personally, not as the agent who directed the plant toward the light, as the principle, as the force that was the tendency toward, expressed in the plant's own biology, operating in the plant's own growth processes, making the plant's movement toward the light the expression of the same cosmic principle that was in the rain reaching toward the earth, and the philosopher reaching toward the truth. He was in the seed. The seed was the completion as potential, the full organism in its potential form, the combination of everything needed for the organism to be the organism it would become. And the seed moved toward the actualization of that potential, moved toward the light and the water and the soil, moved toward the conditions of its own development, moved toward the combination with the world that would make it the organism it was potentially. The seed's movement toward was the movement toward of the potential seeking the actual. Eros was in this movement. He was in the fruit. The fruit was the moving toward that had arrived, was the combination that the movement toward had been directed at, the completion that the plant's movement toward had produced. The fruit was the movement toward at its arrival, the apple that the apple tree had been moving toward from the moment the seed germinated in the soil. He was in the whole cycle of the growing, from the seed's reaching to the fruit's ripeness, from the potential to the actual, from the beginning of the movement toward to its completion, and the beginning of the next cycle's movement toward. Chapter 17. The Love in the Elements. The early naturalists had found him in the elements, had found the force of attraction in the behavior of the material world, in the way that like substances combined with like and unlike substances combined with unlike in the specific patterns of chemical affinity. Water sought water. Iron sought iron. The specific elements had specific affinities, had tendencies toward specific combinations, specific movements, toward that were the expression of the force in the material world. This was Eros in the chemistry. Not the chemistry as the modern science understood it, not the electrons and the orbital mechanics and the quantized energy levels. The chemistry as the ancient world experienced it, the tendency of the material to move toward combination, the affinity of the substance for the specific other substance. The movement toward that was the material world's version of the same force that moved the lover toward the beloved. He was in the magnet. The magnet's pull, the iron pulled toward the lodestone, the force that the ancient world found both useful and mysterious, was the most vivid material expression of the movement toward. Here was matter, inert matter, matter without any biological process and without any psychological process, and the matter moved. It was pulled toward. It had the movement toward, without having any of the apparatus that was supposed to be necessary for the movement toward. The magnet showed that the force was not the property of the living only, not the property of the conscious only, not the property of the desiring only. The force was in the matter. The tendency toward was the matter's own nature. The magnet moved toward the lodestone because the movement toward was in the material of the cosmos, was the cosmos's own fundamental tendency, was the expression at the smallest material level of the same force that was in the plant and the animal and the person and the god. He was in the matter, in the force that held the world together at the level of the material, in the tendency that made the material generative rather than static. Chapter 18. The Love in the Creativity. He was the force in the creative act. This was the claim that the poetic and artistic traditions made about their own practice, that the creation of the beautiful was an expression of the same force as the love of the beautiful, that the maker moved toward the made thing with the same movement, toward as the lover moved toward the beloved. The poet moved toward the poem. The sculptor moved toward the form. The musician moved toward the sound. The philosopher moved toward the truth. The mathematician moved toward the proof. In each case, the movement toward was the same force, the tendency toward the other, the reaching for the combination that will produce something that neither the maker alone nor the material alone could be. The poem was the movement toward realized in language. The sculpture was the movement toward realized in stone. The music was the movement toward realized in sound. The philosophy was the movement toward realized in thought. The mathematics was the movement toward realized in form. He was in the creation, not as the content, not as the thing created, as the force that moved the creator toward the creation, that sustained the movement toward through the difficulty and the failure and the beginning again that the creative process required. The creative process had the quality of the love. The early stages, the excitement of the beginning, the recognition that this was the direction, the first contact with the material that would become the work, had the quality of the falling in love. The middle stages, the difficulty, the resistance of the material, the gap between the vision and the capacity to realize it, had the quality of the love that was persisting through the difficulty, the completion, the work that was finally the work, the form that was finally the form, had the quality of the arrival, the coming to rest in the movement towards destination. He was in the whole of the creative process. The force that moved the creator was the same force that moved the lover. The reaching for the beautiful in the aesthetic sense was the same reaching as the reaching for the beautiful in the erotic sense. Chapter 19. The love in the community. He was the force that held the community together. This was the claim that the political philosophers made alongside the more obviously personal claims. That the love was not only between individuals, but was the force that made the community possible, that held the members of the community in relation to each other, that moved the individual toward the collective. Without the movement toward the other, there was no community. The community was the product of the reaching toward, of the individuals who could have remained isolated, choosing the combination, the shared space, the relation with the other that made the community rather than the isolated individual. He was in the philia, the friendship, the civic affection, the love of one's fellow citizens, that Aristotle argued was the condition of the good political life. Not the romantic love, not the erotic love in the specific sense, but the movement toward the other that was the condition of the political community, the force that made it possible for the citizens to be citizens rather than simply inhabitants of the same space. He was in the hospitality, the xenia, the sacred obligation to the guest, the love of the stranger, that was the most generous expression of the movement toward the other. The hospitality that extended the communities inside to include the outside, that received the stranger as the guest, that moved toward the one who was most different. He was in the treaty, the agreement, the covenant, the force that moved separate parties toward the combination of the shared obligation, the force that was the condition of the possibility of binding agreements between the separate. The movement toward the other was not only the personal love, it was the whole range of the reaching, from the most intimate to the most civic, from the love of the specific beloved to the love of the common good. He was in all of it as the force that made the movement toward possible at every scale. The nature of desire. Part 6. What desire was. Chapter 20. The gap and the gift. He was the force that made the gap productive. This is the most important single claim about Eros, and it needs to be stated carefully because it is easy to misread. The gap between what is and what is desired. The distance between the desiring person and the desired object. The space between the separate things, that the movement toward was directed across was not only the sign of the lack, it was also the source of the movement. The gap was what made the movement possible. Without the gap, there was nothing to move toward. Without the distance, the movement toward had no direction, no destination, no meaning as movement. He made the gap productive by being the force that moved across it. The gap that was only lack was a wound. The gap that had the force of movement toward in it was the condition of the generation, was the opening toward the new thing that the movement toward would produce. This was the gift of incompleteness that he gave, not the completion. He did not complete the incomplete. He moved the incomplete toward the combination that was the completion's condition. He did not fill the gap. He moved across the gap. The gift was the movement itself. The gift was the reaching. The gift was the force that was in the incomplete being that moved the incomplete being toward the combination that would make it more than what it was alone. He was the gift to the incomplete, not the completion, but the movement toward completion. Not the arrival, but the tendency toward the arrival. Not the destination, but the force that moved toward the destination. This was why the philosophical tradition found him so productive for the philosophical account of the good life. The good life was not the life of the complete being, the being who had arrived and needed nothing further. The good life was the life of the movement toward, the life in which the force of reaching was in full operation, in which the person was always moving toward the better understanding, the more beautiful, the more just, the more complete. The good life had Eros. The good life was the life in the movement toward. Chapter 21. The unrequited and the required. The movement toward did not guarantee the arrival. This was the painful truth that the mythology expressed through the unrequited love. The love that was genuinely felt, that was the genuine movement toward, that did not produce the combination because the movement toward was not reciprocated. He was in the unrequited love as much as in the reciprocated. The force of the movement toward was the same force regardless of whether the movement was toward someone who was also moving toward or toward someone who was not. The arrow struck without consulting whether the struck person would return the movement. This was the cruelty that the mythology attributed to him, and that was the mythology's honest acknowledgement of the force's character. The force did not arrange for the reciprocation. The force moved the person toward. What happened at the destination was not the force's responsibility. The unrequited love was not false love, was not the lesser love, the inferior form, the form that would have been real if only it had been returned. It was the real movement toward directed at a specific person who was not in the same movement toward. The reality of the love was independent of the reality of the return. He was in both the requited and the unrequited, as the force. The same force in both cases. The difference between them was not in him, was not in the quality or the intensity or the genuineness of the movement toward. The difference was in the circumstances of the combination that the movement toward was directed at. The mythology of the unrequited love, the long tradition of the love that did not produce the union, was the mythology's acknowledgement that the force was real independently of its outcomes. The force was the force. The reaching was the reaching. The movement toward was genuine whether or not the movement arrived at its destination. This was important for the understanding of what Eros was. He was not the god of the successful love. He was the god of the love, of the movement toward that was genuine regardless of what happened to it, of the reaching that was real regardless of what it reached. Chapter 22. The Beautiful and the Good. Plato's account in the Symposium connected Eros not only to beauty but to the good, argued that the movement toward the beautiful was ultimately the movement toward the good, that the desire for the beautiful was the desire for what was genuinely worth desiring. This was the optimistic account of Eros. The force moved toward the beautiful, and the beautiful was the good, and therefore the force moved toward what was genuinely worth the movement. The desire was reliably directed at the right destination, but the mythology told more complicated stories. The desire that moved toward the beautiful was not always the desire that moved toward the good. The beautiful person could be the wrong person. The beautiful thing could be the destructive thing. The movement toward the beautiful could produce the tragedy as easily as the comedy. He was in the beautiful, and the beautiful was not always the good. The force of attraction was directed by the perceived beauty, and the perceived beauty was not always the genuine beauty, and the genuine beauty was not always the genuine good. This complicated the Platonic account in ways that the mythology was more honest about than the philosophy. The mythology showed the desire going wrong, showed the force in operation in situations where the force produced destruction rather than generation. Not because the force was malevolent, because the force moved where it moved, and the where was not always the where that the good would have chosen. He was the force, and the force was not identical with the good. The force was the movement toward, and the movement toward could be directed at what was worth the movement, and at what was not. The force was not the guarantee of the worthiness of the destination. This was the harder and more honest understanding. The force was real, and the force was powerful, and the force was the condition of generation and creativity, and the good life. And the force was also the source of the worst of the mythological catastrophes, the passions that burned too hot and that destroyed what they were directed at. He was in the beautiful destruction as much as in the beautiful creation. Chapter 23. The Love That Changed Things. The stories of love in the mythology were almost all stories of transformation. The love that changed what it touched, changed the lovers, changed the world around them, changed the course of events in ways that nothing else could have changed them. The love that moved Orpheus to the underworld transformed the underworld, made the stones move, made the rivers stop, made Hades himself weep. The love that moved Zeus toward Ganymede transformed a mortal youth into the cupbearer of the gods. The love that moved Aphrodite toward Adonis was transformed by the loss into the anemone. The transformation was the mark of the force's passage. Where the force moved, things changed. Where the movement toward had been, what had been before the movement toward was no longer exactly what it had been. He was the force of transformation, not the transformer himself, not the agent who decided what would be transformed into what, but the force whose passage produced the transformation. Where the movement toward had moved, the things it had moved through were different. This transformative quality was both the most powerful thing about the force and the most frightening. The transformation was not always toward the better. The transformation was toward the different, and the different could be the better or the worse, depending on the circumstances and the quality of what the force was moving toward. He transformed. He was the force that made things different by being the movement toward. The world that had the force in operation was not the same world as the world without it. This was his most fundamental gift and his most fundamental risk. He made the world different by being the world's own tendency toward the different. The force that remains. Part 7. What he is. Chapter 24. The primordial still in motion. He is still the force. This is the most important claim about the primordial Eros, and the claim that needs to be made directly rather than implied. The force that was the fourth primordial, the force that made the cosmological generative, the force that was the world's own tendency toward combination. This force is still in operation. The atoms are still combining. The molecules are still forming. The cells are still growing. The organisms are still reaching toward the light and the water and the soil. The persons are still moving toward the other persons. The communities are still forming from the individuals who reach toward the shared. The cultures are still developing from the communities that reach toward the more. He is in all of this. As the force. As the movement toward that is the condition of all of these processes. As the primordial principle that was the fourth of the foundations. And that is as fundamental now as it was at the beginning. The world is still generative because the force is still in operation. New things are still being produced from existing things. The combinations are still happening. The movement toward is still moving. He is the movement toward that is still moving. He is the fourth primordial, and the fourth primordial is as present now as it was when the world was first becoming the world. Chapter 25. The love that is not diminished by its forms. He is not diminished by his many forms. This is the trap that the tradition sometimes falls into. The assumption that because Eros appears in many forms, as the primordial force, as the winged boy, as the philosophical ascent, as the romantic desire, as the creative impulse, the many forms indicate a confusion, a lack of a single clear identity. The many forms were not confusion. They were the expression of the range of the force's operation. The force that moved at the cosmological level moved also at the personal level, the biological level, the aesthetic level, the philosophical level. The force was the same force. The levels were different expressions. He was the same in all of his forms. The primordial Eros and the personal Eros, and the philosophical Eros and the creative Eros were not different Eroses. They were the same force in different modes, the same tendency toward expressing itself in the different domains of the world's operation. The unification was the insight that the tradition was working toward from the beginning. The love that was in the cosmos was the love that was in the person, and the love that was in the person was the love that was in the philosophy, and the love that was in the philosophy was the love that was in the creation, and the love that was in the creation was the love that was in the cosmos. One force, many expressions. The expressions did not diminish the force. The force was the same in all of the expressions, and the expressions were the force's own way of being the force in the specific domain. He was the force. He was all of the expressions of the force. He was one. Chapter 26. The teaching of the reaching. He teaches by being the force that is in everything, not by speaking, not by deliberate instruction, but by being the example that is so comprehensive that it amounts to the teaching of what the example is the example of. The teaching was the movement toward itself. Every instance of the movement toward was the teaching. Every time anything reached for anything else, every time the separate moved toward the combination, every time the gap between things was crossed rather than maintained, the teaching was happening. The stone that was moved by the magnet was the teaching. The seed that reached toward the light was the teaching. The friend who moved toward the friend in trouble was the teaching. The philosopher who moved toward the truth was the teaching. The creator who moved toward the form was the teaching. He taught by being in all of these, by being the force in all of these, by being the movement toward that made all of these instances the instances they were. What the teaching taught, that the movement toward was real, that the tendency toward the other was not the sign of the deficiency but the sign of the force, that the reaching was not the evidence of the lack, but the evidence of the life, that the gap was not only the wound, but also the opening through which the new entered. The teaching was about the value of the reaching, not the arrival, not the destination, not the success of the movement toward in producing the combination. The reaching itself, the force itself, the movement toward, regardless of where the movement toward arrived. This was the deepest teaching. The reaching was the good. The force was the gift. The tendency toward was the expression of the most fundamental feature of the cosmos, the feature that made the cosmos generative rather than static, that made the world a world rather than a collection of separate inert things. Chapter 27. The Arrow. Still flying. The arrow is still flying. This is the image that the tradition gave for the force in its most personal expression. The golden arrow that struck and produced the desire. And it is the image that needs to be held at the end. The arrow is still flying because the force is still in motion. The movement toward is still moving. The tendency toward is still the tendency toward. The reaching is still reaching. Every person who feels the desire, for the other person, for the beautiful thing, for the truth, for the created form, is being struck by the arrow. Not by the external intervention of a divine figure who has decided to produce the desire. By the force that is in the person as the force is in everything, expressing itself in the specific desire for the specific thing that the specific person is the specific person capable of reaching toward. The arrow was the mythology's image for the force arriving. The force still arrives. It arrives in the desire for the specific person, the reaching for the specific beautiful thing, the movement toward the specific truth. It arrives in the form appropriate to the person who is being moved. He is in the flying arrow. He is in the arrival of the desire. He is in the moment when the gap between the person and the thing they are reaching for is suddenly the gap that the person is crossing, rather than the gap that the person is merely observing. The arrow is still flying. The force is still the force. The movement toward is still moving. Chapter 28. What he has always been. He has always been the fourth primordial, the force that made the cosmos generative, the principle that was the condition of the world's productivity. the tendency toward combination that was in the matter and in the life and in the person and in the God. He has always been the movement toward, the reaching, the tendency that turned the isolated into the related, the separate into the combined, the potential into the actual. He has always been the gap's gift to itself, the force that was in the gap between things that moved the gap from being only the sign of the separation to being the space through which the movement toward moved. He has always been the love that was before love had a face, the force that was in everything before any specific being had a specific form of the force directed at a specific object. He was and is and will be the force that is the world's own tendency toward itself, the cosmos reaching for its own complexity, the universe's movement toward the more, the further, the combined, the new. Every love that has ever been felt has been his expression. Every creative act has been his expression. Every philosophical reaching has been his expression. Every seed that has reached toward the light, every atom that has moved toward the combination, every person that has moved toward the other person, these have been his expressions. He was the fourth primordial, and he is still what the fourth primordial was, the force that makes the world generative. The movement toward that is the world's own nature. The love that was before love had a name. Epilogue. The force that is still moving. This story was written in the movement toward, not metaphorically. Every word written was written by a being in the movement toward, a being who was reaching for the expression, moving toward the form that would carry the meaning, closing the gap between the understanding and the articulation. Every word was an instance of the force. The story was about the force and was made by the force. Written in Eros, an expression of what it was describing. This is not unique to this story. Every story is written in the movement toward. Every sentence is the crossing of the gap between the thought and the word. Every word is the reaching toward the meaning. Every act of communication is the movement toward the other person. The reaching across the gap between minds that is the fundamental act of language. He is in language. He is in the reaching that language is. Every sentence that is genuinely a sentence, every utterance that is actually moving toward its meaning, actually reaching toward the understanding of the other, is his expression. He is in the reading. The person who is reading this story is in the movement toward, is moving toward the meaning, reaching toward the understanding, crossing the gap between the words on the page and the understanding that the words are pointing at. He is between the writing and the reading. He is in the gap between the writer and the reader. He is the force that makes communication possible. The tendency toward the other, that is the condition of the reaching toward understanding, that is what language is for. He was the fourth primordial. He was before love had a face. He was the force that made the world generative rather than static, the world relational rather than isolated, the world a world rather than a collection of separate inert things. He is the movement toward. He is still moving. Every story that has ever been told has been told in his motion. Every love that has ever been felt has been felt in his force. Every reaching that has ever reached has reached with his tendency. He is Eros. He is the force that moves toward. He is still moving toward. Here ends the story of Eros, the fourth primordial, the force before love had a face, the movement toward, that made the world generative. He was there before the myths began, and he is in the myths and he is in the world. The myths were myths about. He is in the reaching. He is in the gap being crossed. He is in every moment something moves toward something else. He is the force. He is still the force. He is the movement toward. He is still moving toward.